Now listen, we've all been hoping for some baseball news, but not that. The Mets announced yesterday that Noah Syndergaard is going to undergo Tommy John surgery. It's going to wipe out the 2020 season for him and likely a decent bit of the 2021 campaign as well. That follows on the Tommy John surgery for Chris Sale, and it's frankly a bummer. We're going to talk about Noah Syndergaard and his career arc thus far today. Please do head down below, hit that subscribe button for me, and let's get underway. Now, before he was Thor, Syndergaard was just another high school kid in Texas, not really a big MLB prospect for most of the time that he was rising up, but he was a helium guy heading into the 2010 draft. You can see why now, looking at him, big frame, started to add velocity, crept up into the low 90s, and at the time of the draft, he wasn't even on a lot of radars as a top 100, top 200 type of a prospect, but ended up going to the Toronto Blue Jays with the 38th overall pick of that draft, a few choices after Aaron Sanchez, so quite a nice haul there for the Jays. And Syndergaard basically hit every milestone you might have hoped for on his way up through the farm system in the low minors. He was just dominant. High school guy, so didn't obviously get challenged too much right away, but as of 2012 had pretty much mowed through the low minors, had a full dominant season at the Class A level, and at that point, one of the top pitching prospects in all of baseball. But he was not ready to help at the big league level in Toronto, and the Jays were ready to win. You remember, that's the winter that they struck that ridiculous, gigantic deal with the Marlins. The Marlins offloaded all the guys that they had signed just the winter prior. Jose Reyes went in that deal, Mark Burley, Josh Johnson, and a whole bunch of other guys that ended up playing in the big leagues in Miami. Huge trade there. And then the Blue Jays, under then GM Alex Anthopoulos, currently the GM of the Braves, turned their sights to a 38-year-old knuckleballer named R.A. Dickey. Had just had a Cy Young campaign for the Mets and was entering his walk year. Now, the Mets obviously got interest from a lot of teams in Dickey. He was coming off of that outstanding campaign, and despite his age, the guy had a rubber arm, and he was willing to discuss a new deal. In fact, he ended up reaching one with the Blue Jays as part of this whole trade. The way that it came together was that the sides were discussing a deal structured around Travis d'Arnaud, who was an outstanding catching prospect at that time, surefire big leaguer, and the only question was, what was the other main piece going to be? According to Anthopoulos, after the deal got done, the key to that deal was the last thing that the Mets demanded, which was Syndergaard. So he was the key to the deal. There were some other pieces involved there too, but this was d'Arnaud and Syndergaard for Dickey. Now, when you look back at this deal now, you see how important it was to shaping the future of both of those organizations. The Jays obviously had some good years, got some useful contributions from Dickey, but nowhere near what the Mets would end up getting from Syndergaard. Of course, at that time, he still wasn't Thor. As far as we knew, he was just another really good pitching prospect, landed in New York, and immediately showed how good he was in the upper minors, but in 2014, stalled out a little bit at AAA, had a few issues with the results, so didn't quite rush up to the big leagues quite as fast as some people expected. But heading into the 2015 season, the Mets had opportunities to trade him and did not do so. You go look back at the trade rumors we covered at the time, there were some wild scenarios talked about. Troy Tulowitzki was a guy that the Mets were interested in, and we just talked about him the other day. The Mets had interest, but ultimately were not willing to part with Syndergaard. There was a 3-team scenario involving the Nationals and the Rays. Ben Zobrist would have ended up with the Nats. Ian Desmond would have ended up going to the Mets. Wild stuff. Didn't happen. So entering that 2015 season, Thor still needed to go prove himself a bit at AAA. Did just that through his first several starts of the year. And then veteran Mets starter and Mets legend Dylan G came up with a small injury, and that set the stage for Syndergaard's emergence at the major league level. Now, Syndergaard ended up having a monster rookie campaign and followed that up with an even better 2016 season. He was over 180 innings, ERA well under 3, about 10 strikeouts per 9, 2 walks per 9, 50+% ground ball rate, hard to hit long balls off of him, only allowed about half of a home run per 9 innings, just dominant across the board. And this guy, by some measures, was one of the very best pitchers in baseball. In fact, some even thought he was on his way to becoming the preeminent ace in all of baseball. And then came 2017. Syndergaard was dealing with some biceps issues. He didn't want to get an MRI. It was a big controversy at the time. Ended up going out and pitching and came down with a different injury. A lat injury, ended up being a tear, and it really knocked him out for that entire season. Totally lost year. Huge problem for the Mets. Huge problem for Syndergaard, who was at that time lining up for arbitration. So it was fair to wonder in 2018 if Syndergaard was going to be the same guy, but he really largely was. He did deal with a finger injury that year, was limited to 25 starts, but 3.03 ERA, still pumping that typical upper 90s heat. And at that point, you began to wonder if an extension might make sense. But this is where the contract and trade talk type stuff really started to get interesting. Now, at the 2018 trade deadline, there was some discussion whether Syndergaard might be a trade chip, but the Mets really didn't show a lot of interest, and there was never a lot going on there, not a ton of rumors at that time. But reports did emerge in the ensuing winter between the 2018 and 2019 seasons that the Mets were actually quite interested in dealing Thor. You might remember some of those talks. The Padres were especially said to have a lot of interest. There were a whole bunch of different trade scenarios discussed that winter with many teams, but the Mets decided to keep Syndergaard. And in camp that year, the question arose, if you're going to keep him, why not sign him to a long-term deal? Whether or not the Mets tried isn't really clear. They did end up locking up Jacob deGrom, but Syndergaard said, I'm going to bet on my talent. I'm not going to go that route. I expect to reach free agency. So that largely put an end to that discussion. And in the 2019 season, with the Mets struggling badly, as you might recall, it seemed again that Syndergaard would be a trade chip. He was discussed heavily all summer long. Now remember, Syndergaard was not in top form in 2019. He was struggling in the earned run department, giving up a few more home runs than usual, but the stuff was still elite. So you had teams like the Padres, the Astros, and then many others were tied to him in different ways as well. The Rays, the Yankees, the Braves. Of course there were teams looking to this guy. He was still throwing 98, still had that outstanding track record of across-the-board high-end performance. And even though the Mets decided to hang on to him and hang on to Zach Wheeler at the trade deadline, Syndergaard's value probably only went up because he bounced back strong again in the second half, finished better, and now looking ahead, you had 2 more full seasons of control through arbitration over a guy that still has all the talent in the world. The Mets and Syndergaard agreed to a $9.7 million deal for his second to last season of arbitration, the 2020 campaign, and everything seemed to be going just fine until we now know late in camp Syndergaard reported some elbow issues. They didn't get better, and now he's going to go under the knife. Now, it's a bit of a shame because Syndergaard actually had his biggest inning total of his career in 2019, nearly reached 200 innings, finally seemed to be really at full health. But what does it mean for the future? Well, the Mets are going to owe him that $9.7 million or whatever portion of it ends up being paid based upon the 2020 season. And depending upon the way that things are negotiated out with that potentially lost, potentially half season that we're looking ahead to, the team might end up just repeating that salary for 2021. That's typically what happens for arbitration cases where a guy misses an entire season. So you can pencil in another $9.7 million for 2021. Now, is that worth it? You got to stop and think. There are always questions about guys coming back from Tommy John surgery. It's no guarantee that it will go smoothly, and it might only be a half season in 2021 that you're getting. At the same time, you're talking about a guy that's still just 27 years of age, has such an outstanding track record. it's probably worth the money, even if you only get half a season out of him. And remember, Syndergaard would still be eligible to be issued a qualifying offer at the end of that year. You never know what might happen in terms of working out an extension of some kind. You just don't know. So I would say the expectation still is at this point that Syndergaard will be tendered a contract for 2021. So he's likely to remain with the Mets for the time being, but obviously puts a dent in what the team expected at the back end of those seasons of control. Doesn't change the fact that the original trade to get Syndergaard and d'Arnaud was an outstanding deal from the Mets' perspective. And honestly, it's hard to know what this means as to whether Syndergaard will have a longer-term future in New York. We just have no idea at the moment. Please do run down below. Let us know your thoughts on Thor. And do please hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.